My name is Jason.
And my name is Tom.
And this is Fear of a Black Dragon, an old school RPG podcast.
And in this episode, from a freak show to the sewers, to a posh club and a chaotic conclusion, we retrace the arc of my 23rd birthday party in Brixton as we peer into the shadows over Bögenhafen.
Our first segment is the Basic Crawl.
Shadows over Bögenhafen is the first volume of the Enemy Within campaign for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, 1st edition. It was first published by Games Workshop in 1987 and was written by Jim Bamborough, Graham Davis, and Phil Gallagher. Artwork is by Tony Ackland, Dave Andrews, John Blanche, Charles Elliott, Amanda Glass-Watson, Martin McKenna, Ian Miller, Will Rees, Tim Sell, and Ewan Smith. We're going to be reviewing the version published most recently by Cubicle 7, which duplicates the combined Hogshead edition from 1995. So, because this gets a bit confusing, but this book, called Shadows over Bögenhafen, incorporates the adventure itself, but also material from the Enemy Within book that Games Workshop published separately, which is all full of setting information about the Empire and the intro adventure Mistaken Identity. However, we are going to skip all that and just look at the second half of the book, which is the adventure of the title itself.
And that begins on page 59 of the book, where we start with an introduction that explains the backstory of Shadows over Bögenhafen, which is a bunch of wealthy merchants are plotting a chaos ritual to make them all wealthy, except their leader is lying to them. In fact, he sold his soul to a demon, and he's going to sacrifice the cult members' souls in exchange for his own soul. Except the demon that he made a deal with is lying to him. The ritual is really to open a portal to the Chaos Realm, which all manner of demonic entities will be able to pass through. Enter the adventurers. This part gives an overview of how the player characters are likely to interact with the aforementioned sinister plot. Then we have Welcome to Bögenhafen / All the Fun of the Fair. There's a sheep festival going on when the PCs arrive in town. This section of the book details various locations at the fair, including beer tents, a wrestling ring, jousting lists, no commoners please, livestock auctions, and the freak show. The next section is called The Runaway and Beneath the Town, in which we discover that a 3-legged goblin has escaped from the freak show and got into the sewers. The PCs are prevailed upon to find it, since it was kind of their fault it got away. Kind of.
So down there in the sewers, there is a hidden chaos temple, complete with a demon summoning pentagram and a scary, although perhaps bluffing, demon. The next segment then is out of the sewers and a job well done. So once the PCs return to the surface and breathlessly report everything they've seen, they're told that the goblin was caught elsewhere, which they know isn't true because they found its body down there, and they're just dismissed and not paid for any of their work. This is then followed by Places of Interest and the Temples. This is kind of sandboxy information for freeform investigation around Bögenhafen. The Darkest Hour tells us about events on the day of the ritual, and then the ritual, the aftermath, and the apocalypse cover the ritual itself, which is at a new location, not the sewer temple, and what happens if it is or is not stopped in time. The book is rounded out by a gazetteer of Bögenhafen, maps, handouts, and several pre-generated player characters.
So let's talk about how we have used this module in our games. I have merely read it in preparation for this episode. What about you, Tom?
Well, I think I played it when I was in secondary school, which is so long ago I have only the haziest of memories. But more recently and usefully, I have run it twice. In Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 1st Edition, in 4 2-hour sessions, and also in World of Blades, my World of Dungeons but with Blades in the Dark character sheets game, which I think was about 4 sessions as well, but I'm not too sure about that.
Fantastic. So things we liked about this module. I'll kick off by saying that this module contains a lot of detail and texture for the town of Bögenhafen itself. It's pretty darn close to being a whole campaign setting. I mean, you have experience with it, Tom. Do you think you could run, like, multiple adventures in Bögenhafen? I mean, I feel like there's a lot of stuff to work with here.
Yeah, I think you could. In practice, a lot of Warhammer player characters tend to find themselves needing to leave town in a hurry, but I think if you avoided that particular situation, yeah, there's loads of things in here. And a lot of stuff that kind of has coverage, sort of, which I think we might get into when we talk about the structure later. But a lot of things are covered in quite a lot of detail that are relatively unlikely to come up. Some of the merchant houses that are only second fiddle players. And so I think there's loads of things to explore that you never really touch on just through one run of the adventure.
Yeah, the thing I found really interesting about this, and I say this as someone who hasn't read one of these older modules, or at least one quite like this in quite a long time. I mean, I think the closest thing we've done recently for the show is probably maybe Legerdemain, but not even really that, because that was just about like a single location in the town. So this is the first like kind of town-based adventure I've read in a good long while. And I kind of loved how this book has so much detail about, you know, the way the taxes work in Bögenhafen, the various guilds. There's lots of like cultural and civic details about Bögenhafen, which I found really fascinating and made me think that, gosh, like, I think you could do a lot with this, you know, like even like once you get past this adventure, you can imagine all sorts of like little adventure strands kind of like going off of it. And I thought that was pretty great. It was kind of a pleasurable read in that way. Another thing that I liked about it is I really loved the sewer adventure that's in the middle of this. Okay. You go down into the sewer to find this 3-legged goblin. I have run numerous sewer-based scenarios, but there are details in here that I have never actually considered, like in a sewer-based scenario, such as a small one, but I think a significant one, are these explosive methane pockets, right? Like I've run tons of sewer adventures. I've never thought of like having explosive methane pockets, right, as a trap. There's a lot of like interesting information about like what it would be like to be in a sewer and like what that means in a sort of dungeoneering context. And I found that super, super helpful. And I think I'm going to be relying on this for quite a while. I particularly enjoyed how the module calls out small details in the sewer that are meant to make the party think that these very natural occurrences down in the sewer might actually be something like magical. I thought that was kind of fun because it's kind of what we're doing, right? Like it's these characters who might have a reason to see things through a magical veil or whatever, right? And so it's kind of fun to see how the module kind of like plays with that.
Yeah, and I mean, you bring up sewers. This is just one of the many classic Warhammer tropes that in a lot of ways were defined by Shadows over Bögenhafen. The publication history kind of comes out along the lines of the core book comes out in, I think, 1986, and it's got a little bit of this grim and perilous stuff going on. It's written on the cover. But even so, like, it's still quite traditional D&D-ish fantasy. The example character is a guy called Clem Shirestock, that kind of thing. But when you get to Shadows over Bögenhafen, suddenly here we go. You know, we've got sewer crawling, mutants. We've got, what else is in there? Oh, well, I mean, rich people being up to no good and worshipping chaos. People not taking the player characters seriously, no matter what they do. I mean, yeah, being a commoner is really shoved in your face a lot in this adventure. And
it really is. Yeah, I have some questions about that later, but that's actually really interesting. You bring that up about, you know, how this module like kicks off a lot of the classic Warhammer tropes that I'm not familiar with because I have not played anything Warhammer, like nothing, not even a video game. I know almost nothing about Warhammer. And I guess my question for you, Tom, here, just to have a question early.
Okay.
So Warhammer, it's entirely English, right? Like that's an English thing.
Pretty much, yeah.
So do you think there's something particular about Warhammer's creation by English people that makes the tropes the way they are? Like, do you think there's something culturally going on there?
Oh, yeah, I think so. I mean, one of the issues with like D&D in Britain, I think this applies to large swathes of Europe broadly, is that we struggle to take this kind of shiny, heroic stuff seriously. Like in D&D, you're always going around being, I mean, the OSR and its sort of pathetic aesthetic notwithstanding, it's still presented in this quite kind of, you know, boys' own adventure, illustrated books about King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table look, which in the country that produced Blackadder is, yeah, it tends to get undercut very quickly. And so I think that's why you get this black humor, this kind of pessimism, the anti-Thatcher satire, careers in the main book that are based on people that the designers saw when they were out walking in Nottingham in the mid-1980s. Yeah, all that kind of thing. I think you can really see it's very much a product of its time, but it's also, yeah, it's got that kind of sarcastic sensibility to it.
Yeah, that was my feeling on it. This was something I was going to ask during the questions part, but since we're talking about it now, when I was reading it, I was really surprised by how many pratfalls there were in the module.
Yeah.
And how many instances of the PCs just looking like hapless morons, like what's a thing in the module. And I remember reading it and thinking like this D&D modules are not this way. Like D&D modules are just not this way. In D&D modules, it's so much more like sort of heroism is like presumed, right? Like you are a hero. This is particularly true of like, say, 2E, AD&D, right? When it started to kind of come out of the dungeons a little bit, right? Like it had this like more superhero quality almost, right? And so, yeah, I found that super fascinating. I intuited that was a cultural thing that kind of made Warhammer that way, but it's definitely pretty interesting. Okay, the last thing that I really loved about this module is as you're reading it, you get a really good, strong sense that the author really keenly understands what is going to make this fun. The way that certain situations are presented, the advice that the module gives you about like how to unfurl certain things or present certain things. There's a really, really keen understanding of, I know what's going to be fun at the table, so make sure this happens. And at the extreme end, and it's something that I kind of don't love about the module, it can feel a little canned or like scripted. But in general, I found it to be a fairly it wasn't too offensive. Like I appreciated it. And particularly going back to the sewer, there are a few of the monster encounters in the sewer where there are grim portents, right? Built into the text. There's like a slime creature, and you're given like all the information of like how to telegraph the eventual appearance of the slime creature or this thief, right? Like there's a lot of like, oh, make sure you describe some sounds that sound like, someone talking, but maybe it's just a whisper on the wind or whatever, right? To present the thief, right? There's lots of like stuff like that. And above ground too, particularly at the fair, there's a lot of like, this is what's going to make this fun. That tends to kind of go, like I said earlier, it tends to go into the sort of like canned direction.
Yeah.
But it wasn't too bad. What do you think about that?
No, yeah, there are some segments of it that are a little bit like a mini section of railroad that you get locked into. And I think one of the things you're thinking about is the thieves' hideout under a pub. Is that one of the...
That's one of them. There are a number. Yeah, there are a number.
Which is weirdly suddenly prescriptive. Like you've been kind of freeformly wandering around sewers and looking at different things and poking slime monsters. But then... And also, no one ever goes through that door in my experience. I ended up using that pub as somewhere that, because the player characters needed to lay low after burgling someone. So they were like, where's a sketchy pub where if people are asking for us, they'll say we're not here. So they went there. But yeah, it suddenly plunges you into this kind of ream of box text that you're supposed to read. And like, I have a feeling that is just the effect of playtesting. And they were like, a couple of times this happened. So they thought, okay, let's spend 2 pages on this.
Right, yeah.
Just to make sure. And because I think most of the time you just miss those sections. And it is a bit of a problem in that it can be hard to tell just from a read-through which of the important bits to focus on and which of those sections are just there for backup if you wander through a door. And really the key things are just the events of the 3 days, plus the totally misplaced time when one of the Chaos Cult Order people kind of has a change of heart and gets cold feet and comes to talk to the PCs. Those are the things you actually need to track. And everything else you just flip to that page when the PCs wander into that location.
Yeah, I think we'll probably have more to say about that here in a minute, because that's one of the questions I had.
Oh, really? Okay.
But as a general matter, just kind of keeping it onto the things we like, as a general matter, I did appreciate this sense of the author has played this. The author knows what's fun. And I appreciate that, because I'm not really into like railroading as a general matter, but I also know like when I'm preparing my own scenarios, I kind of know like what the big moments are, right? Like I know like the moments that are really going to sing, the ones that people are really going to remember. I know which ones they are, and I know how they have to kind of go down, right? And I kind of appreciate that as a GM.
Yeah.
What else did you like about the module, Tom?
Well, yeah, to address the idea of plotting again, what I did appreciate about the central mystery thread is that it is not really a railroad. It's just a series of things that are happening. And the book has an end scenario where if you just don't stop the ritual, something terrible happens, and that's all covered. And in fact, if you keep reading on in this campaign, the next book, Death on the Reich, talks about how things might be different if they didn't investigate the ritual, like if they just leave town, which is entirely possible. And the clues are... It's not like, oh, let's follow this carefully micromanaged trail of clues. It's all pretty obvious. There's a chaos temple under someone's office. You figure out whose office it is. Then you kind of know what's going on. But it's still very satisfying. And looking at the players' faces as they, read the next bit of handout was great, and sort of came up with in both runs, they came up with completely different plans for how to deal with this as well. So you can see that it is very flexible, even though it has this kind of determined endpoint. So that's very well put together.
Well, that actually segues pretty nicely into questions, I think. Speaking about, the PC's motivations, like they might just leave town or whatever, right? I was having a hard time while I was reading the module figuring out what the party's motivation is here.
Yes, me too.
The PCs really quickly become, or at least the module assumes they quickly become these sort of fantasy Columbos, right? Suddenly knocking on every door in Bögenhafen, right? But it's never particularly clear why they would do this. It's also never particularly clear why the people of Bögenhafen would take them seriously. Why suddenly are people I have to help you or I have to hide my intentions from you? I never quite understood all the mutual motivations here.
Well, to answer your last question first, the people of Bögenhafen absolutely do not take them seriously. There's that one magistrate they talk to who believes their story and then gets poisoned. And then everyone else is just kind of either takes them seriously because they're in the cult and therefore they're just trying to put these idiots off. Or they just kind of don't. They just treat them as random nobodies, which they kind of
are. They definitely are.
And then for the motivation, this was a weird one. So especially, actually, both times when I ran it recently, in the run-up to that moment where the three-legged goblin escapes and you give them a couple of tests to try and catch it so that it's their fault when it runs away, I was thinking, are they really going to go for it? But in both cases, basically the magistrate shows up, says, well, you lot ought to go into the sewers and find it. They just went, okay. So I don't know what magic the writing team weaved back in the 80s to make this work, but it seems to be effective.
Yeah, when I was reading, I was like, yeah, that exact moment when they're like, well, you just go down there and find it. I'm like, why do we need to go down there and find it?
Why would they? Yeah, once they've come back, I think it's much more compelling because they've seen a demon down there and nobody believes them. And
right.
Because they don't know much about the nature of the demon, for example, that it can't actually hurt them, of course they're thinking, well, we could run away from town, but it's a demon. It could probably just follow us, so we should probably do something about this. And then when the moon starts acting weird, that also seems to be a big psychological thing. So it's the sudden plunge into weirdness seemed to be a big motivating factor. If we just leave, this will probably follow us. But yeah, that moment where they decide to go into the sewers, I think maybe people just like going into the sewers. And that's got to
be it. Yeah. I mean, to some degree, we're all just kind of here for adventure, but but that is sort of I don't know, behind their characters' eyes, in that sort of way, if we're really thinking about a character's motivations, it was not clear why they would be doing this. But anyway, the other question I had was we've already kind of covered it, where I was going to ask about the tone of Warhammer generally, because it just feels like there's so many pratfalls and situations where the PCs are getting randomly arrested or mistaken for people. It's just stuffed with stuff like that, They go to the auction that's happening and they just get mistaken as bidders in the auction. There's just some little moments where the PCs are just seem like bumbling idiots, there's a hole, there's a hole and they fall in the hole,
That's pretty common too. Yeah. But I think what I would say about this is that all of that stuff it's a long drawn out run up of bumblingness until you get to the end. And in many ways that made it a lot more satisfying. Also a bit of old school resolution mechanics made the Warhammer resolution of this very satisfying as well. Because in, let's say, a more story-focused game where you would do your, grand stopping the ritual roll by spending all those hero points you've been banking through doing different things, it would feel satisfying. But in this particular occasion, let me tell you about my character moment. We had a guy, he waited until someone was about to be sacrificed, and then he fired his crossbow at the high priest guy. And he got the kind of lamest possible critical hit result, because Warhammer does that with hit locations. He just happened to roll the right hand and just happened to get the thing that doesn't really do any damage but makes you drop whatever you're holding. And we were like, this is amazing. This is the best thing ever. And there's something about having really slogged through falling in sewers and being ridiculed and ignored, and then still stopping this whole thing, that is, I think, makes it actually seem much more heroic at the finale than it would if you thought you were a badass from day one.
kind of tied to that, can we talk about the demon down in the sewer?
Oh, yeah.
My read of the module is that encounter is really humorous, or like just weirdly matter of fact. Like, so just for proper context, they go down to this space and this like alleged demon or whatever, this guardian thing, like appears. Doesn't it like start as like a smoke or something? I can't remember exactly.
Yeah, so the candles billow smoke and it appears out of it, I think.
Yeah. In any case, you communicate with it, and like it just seems like such a oddly comic moment that I wasn't sure, like, was it supposed to be scary? Like, what's your read on that?
In play, it was scary. I mean, it's mechanically scary. They have to make a terror test. But everyone absolutely freaked out and normally tried to run away. One player in one of the games started to suspect, wait, I don't think this thing can come out of the circle. But while they were kind of advancing this theory, all the other characters were going, well, you can stay and test it if you want, because we're getting out of here.
I think that's just how you sold it, though, because the text of the module, the demon's speech really sounds like funny to me. Like, it sounds so like he should be just a guy named Tim or something, right? Like, it doesn't sound like threatening. So I don't know. Anyway, I guess it's just how you kind of sell that moment. My last question, could this adventure have been about 40 pages shorter? How much of this quite lengthy adventure, it runs something like 80 pages or something, right? How much of this is just advice or inspiration? How much of it needs to be followed really closely? If it does need to be followed closely, is that easy to do? Because it seems like it'd be really complicated to navigate this module the way it's set up. What are your thoughts here?
Yeah, it is a bit difficult to navigate because of some decisions that probably make sense for some groups, but for others don't, about where the information about different characters and locations is placed. The big problem is that there are some events that are not placed in the timeline of events, despite being important. So my advice would be, and in fact what I did was, print out the bit where it says, like the few pages where it explains what happens after they've come up from the sewers, and then up until the ritual. I think it's like a couple of pages. Write in on day 2 or 3 that one of the people comes to talk to them. And then you've got your timeline. That's what you have to remember. And everything else, you can just let them bumble around. And if you suddenly remember, oh, wait, that's in the book somewhere, when they decide a place on the map to visit, then just go to that page, and it will normally have quite a lot of stuff about it and some information, some of which is quite subtle. But otherwise, just kind of keep it in reserve, I think, or just soak it in, like you say, as inspiration. I've
got some stuff to say about this during the Expert Delve, but that was my sense. There's so much information, and so much of it is, well, if the players choose to do this, then we'll do this. But it's not like cross-referenced or anything. Like if they're over in place A and they decide to go over into place, C, the book is not laid out to like figure out like where place C is very easily. Right?
No. And as we've kind of mentioned earlier, some of the largish sections are just very specific, and it seems to be a write-up of, or how to handle what happened in someone's game, even though it's unlikely to happen in yours.
Yeah, it really is. It's like, if they choose to go to the inn and don't pay their bill, it's like real specific stuff. Did you have any questions? I know you had a question about kind of like the old school.
Oh, I did. Yeah, this is sort of a broader thing. I mean, basically it's an am I right kind of question, which is, am I right in seeing in this the kind of beginnings of what will become the trad mainstream format in the years to come? So you've got this kind of sandbox, keep on the Borderlands-esque, here's a town that you can interact with thing. But then you've also got these sections saying, well, if the PCs try to do this, it doesn't work because blah. And then if they do this, it also doesn't work. And there's not too much of that. So it doesn't become an exercise in frustration, I think. The tendrils of railroadiness.
I think you're probably right. The most damning of all of these incidents is probably near the very end, where if the players made a good go at stopping the ritual, but didn't actually stop the ritual, then a rat or something disrupts the ritual.
Oh, yeah. Luckily that didn't happen for us. I don't think I would have followed through with that.
Yeah, it's like they tried really hard, they failed, but it would be better if the ritual didn't go off anyway. So have a rat disrupt it. Like just stuff like that. Like there are lots of little moments like that. There are smaller like moments which, I think are more fun and not too consequential, where the railroadiness doesn't bother me. Like if they just happen to be in a certain place at a certain time, there's a chance they get framed for something, or they get like there's a mistaken identity or whatever. It's usually like small stakes stuff, that, maybe they spend a night in jail or whatever. That doesn't bother me as much. But there are some like big plot parts, like the Thieves Guild part, where it's like really, really railroady.
Yeah.
Let's go to the chain lightning round. I'm going to start by saying that there's a section near the beginning of the module called Enter the Adventurers, and it gives this short, just a 3-paragraph sequence of what is meant to happen in this adventure. Like, this is the basic outline of what is going on in this adventure. Lots of modules surprisingly don't do that, and I found that to be particularly helpful in this one because it's so long.
All right, I have a favourite NPC in this, which is Dr. Malthusius, the owner of the Zoocopia from which the 3-legged goblin escapes. He is great fun to play because he's all pally and supportive of the player characters, and I always play him with a sort of Professor Brian Cox voice, come and see the wonders of the far reaches of the world in my amazing Zoocopia.
I'm going to say the wharf tax, the rate of which is determined by how much riverfront you occupy. This is paced out every year by tax officials who are usually halflings, since their shorter pace leads to higher revenue.
The creepy page boy, who, spoiler alert, turns out to be the demon in disguise, is really great, and he has a horrible, creepy illustration, which I had to show players as often as possible. He is particularly good in Gothic and, creepy page boys.
If I had $1. I like the auction procedure. So there's this auction that goes on in the sheep fair, and in the fiction, the auctioneers are just there selling cows and pigs or whatever. But what I love about this in the text is it has like this table that you roll on. It's a really like neatly designed little auction thing. It's a way of mechanizing the auction. Found that super fun. It's one of those things that you would imagine happening a lot in a fantasy world, but when you actually sit down at a role-playing table, it's maybe not the easiest thing to role-play, right?
Yeah.
And so I appreciated that.
My last one is the Leering Chaos Moon. So in the Warhammer world, they have 2 moons, one of which is associated with chaos. And as the time of the ritual grows closer, the Chaos Moon appears to move lower and lower until it's only apparently a few hundred feet above the streets of the city, and a face grows on it and it grins at people in the street, terrifying the passers-by. And I found this was very effective as an end of session description as we wrapped up. I would describe what the moon was doing that night, and that kept everybody busy thinking about what was going on for the week until the next session.
There was an N64 Zelda game that had that.
Yeah, one of my players kept mentioning that Zelda game, which I have not played.
Yeah, like it had that exact thing happening, yeah. Let's go to the Expert Delve. It's the Expert Delve. So there are several instances in the module where the author says that you, as the GM, should be ready to improvise the NPCs and what they're doing when the players encounter them. Like I said earlier, the author seems to have a really keen understanding of what is going to make this adventure enjoyable. And it seems to be one of those things, and I have to agree, is going to be how well the GM is able to make the residents of Bögenhafen feel authentic, right? I think that is going to be a major part of the enjoyment here, is embodying these NPCs, making them feel like authentic people. So I thought that would be a fun thing to explore, Tom.
Yeah, sure. And you're right. I think that was going around talking to different people and them actually being different was one of the fun things. And on this issue, obviously the major characters are given descriptions. So, you can meet the various plotters and great and good of the town. And they're given a description, but also players will often spring on you requests to go and meet characters you've never heard of, or, nameless peasant on the left. And I think that can be a bit more difficult in terms of making them interesting without derailing the scene and like making it about the NPC's quirk.
So to kick off, I want to say that one of the things I really love about the Hydra Cooperative books that we've covered lately and that I've read, even the ones we haven't covered, one of the things I like about that company's books is that they encourage their authors to really talk about how to role play the major characters. I think that is fantastic advice. And indeed, when we did our Operation Unfathomable episode, we talked about a lot of the sort of performative aspects of this topic, right? For my notes, at least, I'm not going to focus on the performative aspects because I think that we did a pretty good job on that episode. But, that said, the performative aspect of this is really important. It's definitely not something to discard. And I'm going to have a little bit to say about it, I suspect. But I think I want my emphasis here to be really on NPC motivations and sort of how to add texture to the lives of the NPCs so that they seem more real. So kicking off with NPC motivations, I'm going to throw to you, Tom. What are your thoughts here?
Yeah, well, I mean, in preparing for this episode, we are quite fortunate in that the latest version of the Principia Apocrypha came out recently, which is a kind of guidebook of not how to play OSR games, but sort of how to approach old school play. It's kind of a compilation, bits of advice assembled by David Perry.
They're excellent, yeah.
Yeah, and one of the things that he writes in that is, and I'm going to quote now, give NPCs a motivation or concern that does not involve the PCs. This lends them some depth and grounding, as well as giving the PCs a lever to pull, if they can find it. And we're also able to unite the worlds of OSR and indie hippie story games, because in the, oddly enough, Rockford Files-based podcast hosted by indie luminaries Nathan Palletta and Epidiah Ravachol, they often talk about this idea of using a thing that often shows up in Rockford Files episodes, where some minor guy that the main character, private detective Jim Rockford, meets will have a motivation or something they're concerned about that just isn't related to the plot of the episode, but that kind of creates a bit of friction or an interesting feature in the scene. So like, it might be a gas station attendant, Rockford needs to use the phone, but the gas station attendant's busy thinking about something else, or he's being trailed by a couple of mafia goons and one of them is really hungry and wants to go get a hot dog. And it can be as simple as that. And it just sort of brings life and interest into all of these scenes.
I agree completely. I mean, when I put together a scenario, I like to give the NPCs at least one motivation, the principal thing that kind of drives them. And like you said, it is usually something that doesn't have anything to do with the player characters, right? It's just something that drives them. So that's something I usually do. I also give every major NPC a way that I can embody them at the table. That's the performative aspect, right? A verbal tick, a thing they say a lot, a body posture that I do at the table, that kind of thing. I try to, at a minimum, do those two things for every NPC that I think is going to be an important part of the story, or that the player characters could run into. It is a sort of minimum, right? I think you can do a little bit more. If the characters are known figures in the community, what do they want from the player characters? That can be helpful on the fly, like to have access to. They have their personal motivations. They have what drives them. And what do they want from the PCs, right? Like what is the kind of like thing that if they get a chance, what will they ask for? I don't think that's super important for Shadows over Bögenhafen, but it is something that I do.
There is a good example in Shadows over Bögenhafen of just that kind of motivation plus, once they find out the PCs exist, what they want from them. And that is the younger Steinhager brother, where he is the second eldest son in this family business, and his older brother is the one who's in the secret Chaos Order. So when he finds out about it, his reaction is, well, to the PCs is, oh, this is terrible, we've got to do something about that. But then, because his motivation is, I want to be in charge of the family business, he tries to recruit them to secretly kill his brother, because as he explains it, well, that would stop the ritual, but I mean, I don't think anyone would believe you if you told them about it. So this is probably the only way. And like, that's really great, because like, he doesn't care about the plot of the adventure. All he cares about is that family business thing. And just as an aside, yes, one of the groups did take him up on his offer.
Nice. So, that's actually a pretty good segue to the next thing I wanted to say, which is if I were to run Shadows over Bögenhafen, I've mentioned it a couple times already, but I think that this book is kind of a mess to navigate. It's got a lot of cool stuff in it. I don't know if it's like a pleasurable read, but it's interesting. It's fun at times, But I think that like in the moment as the GM, I think I would have a difficult time focusing on how to play the characters, because I would be so busy trying to figure out what is the next thing that needs to happen, right? Yeah. And so what I would do in preparation for running this is I would go through it and I would list out all the major NPCs. And then I would do what I just said for all of them. I would give them a motivation, possibly a sub-motivation. And you could pull that from the text, right? You're not making it up. It's I would just list it out and note it in that way.
Judicial use of the highlighter pen is very useful in this scenario in particular.
Yes, exactly. And honestly, at that point, I probably would never have to look at the book again, if I'm being honest. If I went through it and just like noted a few things about their motivations and what they're up to and had it like in a nice, easy Google Doc, I think that would be sufficient for me. And then I could really, really focus on the characterization. So if there's anything else, is there anything else you want to say about motivations?
There is a bit, actually, because we're talking about preparing for the NPCs we know about, but there's also the NPCs we don't know about. And
Right.
there was one in particular I had to make up on the fly that worked quite well when I ran this. So our wizard's apprentice shows up in town, and her avenue of investigation was, is there a kind of bookstore around that might sell wizardy books, which, cultists would be interested in? And I thought, not really, not on the town map. But of course, yeah, it makes sense. There would be, this is a society kind of 16th century-ish. You can have books printed. There would be some kind of scrivener. So she went there, and then I had to take a moment, and so taking a moment to think about what's going to happen is useful. And people will bear with you if you're just quiet for a moment. So I kind of thought through what's going on. Well, everyone's at the sheep festival. So the main guy who's the master calligrapher or what have you, probably isn't there. He's down at the jousting lists, drinking port and laughing. So then she met the 17-year-old apprentice who's been left behind minding the shop and is absolutely terrified that he's going to spill ink on something or robbers are going to come in. That was an interesting scene because he was guarded and worried about something going wrong on his watch. And she didn't care about that at all, but she had to deal with the side effects of it, which was him being ludicrously nervous and not knowing what to say to a girl.
Okay, so let's talk about another thing, which is adding texture to the NPC's world or adding texture to your encounters with NPCs. This is something I really focus on in my gaming. I've talked about this kind of thing before, but I definitely think it is going to go a really long way toward making Bögenhafen and scenarios like it that are so mundane NPC focused more interesting, right? I think it's going to go a long way here. And so for a situation like this where you're running into lots of NPCs, I would do a very limited version of my paint the scene technique that focuses on just the personality and circumstances of the NPC in question. Basically, the idea is whenever there's like an interesting big ticket encounter or set piece, you pose a question to the table that helps you explore a particular aspect or idea of the set piece. And so you kind of pose this question and the players give you a chance to kind of describe what they see in their mind's eye that helps like emphasize a thematic point. So that's something I do a lot. It's a very powerful technique. I recommend it strongly. I have written about it extensively on the Gauntlet blog. I think that what you want here is a sort of a limited paint the scene process where you just pose a question to maybe like one player or maybe two players. This is particularly important to keep it kind of restrained to just one or two players, because if you're running into lots of NPCs, like I suspect you're going to in Bögenhafen, your session would take 9 hours if every time you did this for a new NPC, everybody got to offer some input. This is kind of what it would look like. Some examples. How do you know this person is not to be trifled with? And then maybe the player describes their nasty scar across their face or something like that, right? How can you tell this person is under a lot of pressure? Perhaps the players describe their fidgety, nervous hands, their sort of sunken bags under their eyes or whatever. What do you see in the shop that lets you know this NPC has fallen on hard times? Things like that. I think that you can just pose these little questions, get a player or two to kind of give you an answer about it. And I think it helps just sort of enrich the world. I think it helps make their environment seem a little bit more realistic, and it's a collaborative thing too, so it's not all in the GM.
Yeah, because of course you're asking questions, but really you're telling them, this person is under a lot of pressure.
Exactly,
or
right.
The ones I did when I ran Shadows was, this guy is nouveau riche, and they described how terrible his artwork choices were.
Right, yeah.
And yes, it's actually a bit tight to define. I mean, some people are a bit wary of paint the scene and similar questions in PBTA things because they think it's too much narrative control being given to the players. But the secret is, it's not actually narrative control. It's just me saying, here's a picture of a parrot. You can make it any color you want, but it's a parrot. Okay,
it's
so
parrot.
Whatever. Yeah. And I did use that, as you say, in quite limited ways in Shadows over Bögenhafen. So just taking the facts about different NPCs and frankly, taking the burden of being interesting and creative off myself so I could think about something else and letting, one character. I think it's important to ask the question of a character rather than a player, because then you can have a different answer or a different kind of answer from a boatman compared to a wizard's apprentice compared to the physician's student.
Yeah, that's a terrific point. Absolutely. One other little thing I'll say here is for the bigger NPCs, I think you definitely want to do the full paint the scene where you ask everybody to contribute. I think a great example in Shadows of Bögenhafen is probably going to be when you first start talking to that lesser merchant family. There's like the 4 big merchant families, and one of them is like not quite as rich and not quite as great. I think that's a terrific opportunity to like to pose a really good paint the scene question of like, what do you see in their manner that lets you know that they're just maybe like one cut below, right?
Yeah.
Anything else you want to add about sort of adding some texture and life to NPCs?
No, I think we've covered it pretty well. Yeah, so what have we got? Limited paint the scene, plan ahead, and if you need to improvise, just take a bit of time before you say anything.
Yeah, and please do go listen to the Operation Unfathomable episode as well of this show, where we talk more about the performative aspects of this, because I think that's like a big part of this. Let's go to Companion Adventures. Hi listeners, I have 3 things to tell you about this month. The first is that Codex Asphalt is now available in our $4 Patreon feed. This is our biggest issue ever. It features Pack of Strays Wolf Run, a card-based game inspired by Fall of Magic set in the Pack of Strays universe, Wheels on the Road, an original post-apocalyptic Forged in the Dark game, and much more. The second thing I want to tell you about is GauntletCon 2018. GauntletCon 2018 will be held from October 18th through the 21st. The full schedule of over 200 games is available, and Gauntlet Patreon supporters can register for those games right now. The last thing I want to tell you about is the Codex Volume 1 Kickstarter. Yes, that's right, the Gauntlet will be launching its very first Kickstarter campaign on October 2nd. The campaign will be to fund a beautiful hardcover book collecting the first 13 issues of Codex. We want to go all out to make this book as gorgeous as possible, to make it the ultimate Gauntlet collector's item, but we will definitely need your help to do so. Also, we'll be making a limited number of these books available at a deep discount for our Patreon supporters, so be sure to keep your eyes open for this campaign when it launches October 2nd. For more information on everything we do in the Gauntlet, go to gauntlet-rpg.com. Thanks. It's the Companion Adventures. Regrettably, I have not had as much time as I would have liked to plan Companion Adventures. Listeners, I'm so sorry. Fortunately, Tom is very ready. Tom, we have.
Well, you said, I mean, honestly, this is a lot of work. It's quite hard to find things that match the Warhammer vibe. A lot of things that are set in the right period are all about soldiers and nobles, which is not good for us. But I've found a few things. Let's begin with the very practical, and that is an RPG supplement, which is free. And it is called The Enemy Within, a Companion. And that is by a guy who writes under the pseudonym Gideon, coincidentally the name of the demon from Shadows over Bögenhafen, on the blog Awesome Lies, all in capitals. And you want the PDF entitled Preface, Intro, and Phase 1, which covers Shadows over Bögenhafen and the preceding material. And one thing that's very useful here is it has a little diagram mapping out the order in which things happen in the scenario, so you can keep track of where you're supposed to be and which pages you need to flip to get there. And it also has some tips on how to prepare for the adventure. The things you should be highlighting in the text, basically.
Splendid. I have a couple of game things too. First, I want to suggest a book that is not out yet, but I have gotten a glimpse of it. And it is called Improv for Gamers by Karen Twelves. Evil Hat is going to be publishing this book. It's kickstarting soon. What I think is going to be really interesting about Improv for Gamers is that it talks about improv skills, but like with a really heavy gamer focus. Like the perspective is very much like what is helpful to gamers, right? Normally when you read improv books, you have to kind of infer all that stuff and figure it out. And so that's something to keep an eye out for, just because of when we were talking earlier about like making NPCs come alive. I do think that there is a performative improv aspect to it that I don't want to ignore here because I think it's super important. The other thing is I'm going to recommend Dogs in the Vineyard. If you are not super steeped in hippie story games, Dogs in the Vineyard is a classic by Vincent Baker. And to my mind, Dogs in the Vineyard is like the book that really like laid out, for me at least, what modern GM prep kind of looks like. And I think the way that it talks about creating communities, creating NPCs, how to like create NPCs in a way that they are functional and have lots of like texture, but to where you're not creating a bunch of work for yourself. I think that that is a fantastic text that I think everybody should read, at least for that purpose, GM section.
All right. And now I'd also like to recommend something, I guess, indirectly that is not yet released, because I have a film to talk about. It's a short film called Unranger, which is Irish for The Ranger. It's a 10-minute long short that came out in 2008. You can find it on YouTube. which is about one of the Connaught Rangers returning to Ireland from serving in the British Army overseas. And one of the things I think is a little bit difficult about Warhammer sometimes, and similar toned games, maybe a bit of Lamentations, that kind of thing, is doing the grim part of Grim and Perilous without necessarily the black comedy. The comedy bit is easy. You know, terrible things happen. You fall into a sewer and die, I believe Groucho Marx said. Hilarious. But grim without funny can be quite difficult. And this short film is a very good example of grim. You will probably hear more about it soon, because later this month, that's September 2018, the feature-length sort of inspired by movie starring Hugo Weaving is coming out, and that's called Black 47. And I assume will be in English rather than Irish, because they will want people to go and see it. Finally, my other atmospheric one is a spot of music that is Works for Violin and Piano by Bela Bartok. He was I always get this wrong, is sort of an ethnic Hungarian Romanian composer, or the other way around, difficult to tell, who has worked in the kind of the early 20th century and was also an ethnomusicologist. So his works often combine kind of Middle European folk sounds, like you might hear around the pseudo-German setting of the Empire and Warhammer, with these very modernist sound textures, which are, as we all know, the music sounds of the horror genre. And so if you can, track down Works for Violin and Piano, or really any of his non-opera works, and you will have a good mix to go with Shadows over Bögenhafen.
Fantastic. Listeners, that's our show. Fear of a Black Dragon is a production of The Gauntlet. If you'd like to get in touch with The Gauntlet, we can be found on Twitter at GauntletRPG. We have a G Plus community. Just go to the community section of G Plus and search for The Gauntlet. You will find us there. We have a website. It's gauntlet-rpg.com, and we are on Patreon at patreon.com/gauntlet. Tom, thanks so much.
Thank you, Jason, and thanks to Paul for editing.
Indeed. Yes. Any award-winning podcast editor, Paul Edson.
Indeed.
Thanks, listeners. Take care.